Yeah, Alex, I think you're okay to hit record. Okay, right, I'll start properly now. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here chairing today. I'm Sarah Vibert, I'm the Interim Chief Executive at NCVO, and absolutely thrilled to be launching our 2021 Almanac publication. It's so lovely to see so many friends, colleagues, collaborators, partners here today. So last year, in my previous role as Director of Public Policy, I was working closely with our partners across infrastructure on securing the £750 million from government in the wake of the pandemic. And it was data from the Almanac that was so vital in convincing the government that the sector needed support so we could continue to deliver services to people and communities. So the Almanac remains one of the most important and comprehensive pieces of research on the voluntary sector. And we know the data is used by many organisations, TSRC, the Office of National Statistics, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, local infrastructure organisations, academics, so a really widely used data set. But it's the Almanac is very much a collaborative endeavour. So just to start with a few thank yous, which is thank you firstly to the ESRC, who provide multi-year financial support for the Almanac. And also thank you to Saracen and Partners, who very generously sponsored this year's publication. Also, a big thank you to our partners at Queen's University in Belfast for their arduous data processing work. And also to the Third Sector Research Centre for their support on our research work. There's also one or two individuals at NCVO, so NCVO colleagues who I want to thank. I particularly want to thank Mark Lawson, who is sadly leaving NCVO shortly and has had a huge role in the Almanac during his time at NCVO. I'd also like to thank Oliver Chan in the team, as well as our previous research colleagues, so Veronique Gaucham and Lisa Hornan for their contributions to this year's publication. So the whole project has been overseen this year by Anya Martin, who we'll be hearing from later. She's only recently joined NCVO and she has led this absolutely superbly. So a couple of bits of housekeeping before we get on with the main body of the session. So firstly, if you could keep your mic on mute, that would be great. But please do turn your videos on. It's great to see everybody. As I've already said, we're recording today's event and we will use this on our channels after the event. Please, while we're going through the session, but certainly once we get to the Q&A at the end, please do ask questions in the chat box. And there is a specific Q&A session at the end when we will answer these. And then the final thing to say is you've probably already noticed that we're enabling closed captions and you do have the option at the bottom of your screen to turn those off if you want to do that. So I'd now like to introduce Richard Maitland, who's partner and head of charities at Saracen and Partners, one of the UK's leading charity investment managers. Richard, over to you.
Sarah, thank you very much. And I think the first thing I just want to say is an incredible well done to you, Anya, and your team. It is just the most extraordinary piece of work. And I think just the fact that the Almanac exists is fabulous for the sector. And as you've noted this year, £750 million worth of tangible value as a result of previous editions and all the work that goes into it. So long may it continue it. And Saracen and Partners are delighted to sponsor and help in any way that we can. I generally think the view of the sponsor is to say incredibly little. I just wanted to say one thing that I picked out of the compendium myself, though, which is just the scale of the distributed impact that this sector has in the UK and further afield. And my simple math said that, we generate about 56 billion pounds worth of income is generated and spent on charitable causes by the sector. The people working within the sector are valued at about 24 billion. So you can make a case for the distributed impact of the sector being something in the order of 75 to 80 billion pounds per annum. I mean, that is an extraordinary number. Now, just to contextualize this, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm an investment manager by trade and I like to value things. the FTSE 100 index, the entire dividend paid out by all the 100 companies in the FTSE 100 index also this year will happen to be about 75 billion pounds. So I then sort of thought, well, how big an endowment fund would you have to have if you needed to fund the entire charitable worth every year, ongoing forever? And the answer is about 1.8 trillion pounds, i.e. the same value as the FTSE 100. So just to put it in context, the sort of capitalized value of this sector in the UK is just shy of 2 trillion pounds, pumping out 75 to 85 billion a year. And I just think it is just a fantastic achievement for the UK over many decades to have reached this level and to have a third sector having this impact on society. So forgive me for playing with the numbers, but this is really just to say an incredible well done to the NCVO and to everybody that helped them, and well done, and long may we see the Almanac every single year. And on that note, over and back to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Richard. And so now we're going to move on to the kind of main body of the event. So I'd like to introduce Anya Martin, who's NCVO's Research and Insight Manager, and she's going to talk us through this year's findings. Anya, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Richard, as well. As Sarah says, I'm Anya, I'm the Research and Insight Manager, so I've been working on this project for a few months with my team, and I also want to echo Sarah's thanks to Mark and Oliver, who did much of the work on this project, and it is an absolutely massive project as well. So thank you to them and to everyone else across NCVO and our partner organisations who have helped us bring it about. So today I want to talk about, firstly, what the Almanac actually is, the size and scope of the sector that it demonstrates, income and income sources, spending, workforce and volunteers, all of these things that the Almanac looks at. And for each of these, what I've done is selected a few interesting charts and tidbits, but I do want to make it very clear that this is really the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what's in the Almanac. It's a huge resource and it contains all manner of things, so please do have a look. So what the Almanac actually is, and we've been publishing it for 25 years already, almost 25 years. And it's essentially the definitive reference publication about the voluntary sector and its role in society. So we draw from a variety of data sources, including detailed administrative records like Charity Commission, the Register, and major national surveys run by the ONS and DCMS. And we supplement this using a sample of around 10,000 charities' annual accounts and their reports, which we then aggregate and weight to match the size of the sector as a whole. And gathering these accounts is a really, really intensive process. Firstly, because they're submitted in a PDF format, which means they have to be manually digitized by the team at Queen's University in Belfast. And then because there's no standardized reporting format, each item has to be classified. And we use machine learning to do this. So once everything is classified, we do a number of manual checks and then we conduct the analyses. So it does mean it's the most accurate source of data on the finances of the sector, and it's an absolutely massive achievement that we do it, and we couldn't do it without our partners as well. In fact, it's such a good resource that the Office for National Statistics actually uses it as part of their estimate of the national GDP. But due to the time it takes for accounts to be submitted to the Charity Commission and then input and analysed, most of our data for finances covers the financial year 2018-19. So in order to ensure the relevance to the present day, we've also supplemented this with more recent sources of data and included a series of spotlights on issues within the sector over the last year as well. So on to the size and scope of the sector. Bit of a pop quiz here, so feel free to put your guesses into the chat. How many voluntary organisations do you think there are in the UK? There are just over 163,000 of them. This is actually a slight reduction on the previous year, down from about 166,000 the year before. And as you can see from this table, the vast majority are micro or small charities, meaning that they have an annual income of £100,000 a year or less. So these organisations would have at most a handful of staff members. The sector is very much dominated in numbers by these types of organisations. And it's worth saying here that this includes only organisations that fall under what we call the general charities definition. So it excludes registered charities such as housing associations, universities and independent schools. Like this is the voluntary sector proper, as it were. While there has been a small fall in the number in the last year, it does follow a few years of relative stability. So there was a steady rise in the number of organisations from the early 2000s, and then a fairly substantial drop during the financial crisis in 2008. And then not much change since then, really. So I think overall, it's probably fair to categorise the number of charities in the UK as fairly sticky. It doesn't really change very much, except for in response to major financial crises. And unfortunately, as I've mentioned, this is based on 2018-19 data, so we don't know yet what the impact of COVID has been, but it is possible, and I'd say probably quite likely, that we'll see another dip in the same way that we did in 2008. So the majority of organisations, they're small, they operate locally. 8 in 10 organisations have an income of less than £100,000 a year, and most of these work solely at a very local level. And while big in numbers, they make up only 4% of the sector's overall income, 5% of its spending, and even less of the sector's assets. And at the other end of the spectrum, very large organisations, so those that have over £1 million a year in income, account for 3.5% of all the organisations, but 82% of the sector's income and 87% of its assets. And these organisations tend to work at a national or international level. Now, the overall makeup of the sector does appear to be shifting towards bigger organisations. So the number of the largest super major organisations, those with an income of over £100 million a year, has more than doubled over the last decade, from 26 to 59 now in the UK. And major organisations, as we call them, have an income of 10 to 100 million, have also grown quite rapidly, as you can see in this chart. Now, you know, I mentioned earlier that the number of organisations has reduced. So if you are listening keenly, you might have noticed that that must mean we are seeing a reduction in the number of smaller organisations specifically. In fact, previous almanacs have highlighted this, that we're seeing not only reductions in the number of micro organisations, very small organisations, but also that larger organisations are taking an increasing share of income and assets. In other words, that we're seeing growing inequality between voluntary organisations. But it's not really as it seems. Some of the growth in bigger organisations is linked to a natural expansion of the income bands. So when we started the Almanac many years ago, we created these size categories. For instance, micro charities with an income of less than £10,000 a year. But because of inflation, £10,000 in the year 2001 was worth a lot more than £10,000 is today. And we've kept the income band classifications the same over the course of this time for ease of reporting and to help people understand it. But organisations' incomes have grown with inflation as well. So this means that organisations that would have been considered micro in 2001 are considered small organisations now. They've moved up a size boundary. And we've also seen things like public sector bodies moving into the sector and other organisations growing out of mergers. So in other words, we are seeing an increase in larger organisations while smaller ones are disappearing. And of course, a larger share of the sector's income as well. But much of this is because of inflation and it's not a real change. And apologies if this is a bit boring and technical, but I hope it's a bit clearer if you look at these two charts. The first is the proportion of voluntary organisations by size over time. And you can see that micro and small organisations have been declining relatively quickly over that time. And the second is the same chart adjusted for inflation. And you can see that while there has been a slight decrease, it's actually quite stable overall. And in future editions of the Almanac, we've decided to adjust these categories for inflation because we think it will make it clearer that we're actually not seeing particularly large changes in the sector's size or composition over the last 20 years. The fact that there hasn't been a great deal of change, in fact a slight reduction on pre-crisis levels in the number of organisations, means that we do have fewer charities per person in the country now. But this could be a good thing because it means that more efficient charities are delivering the same or more impact instead of lots of similar organisations stepping on each other's toes. Or it could be a bad thing because it means fewer people engaging with the sector. I'm not going to make a decision on that, but it's something to reflect on. So on to income and income streams. I've got another pop quiz for you. Where do you think most voluntary sector income comes from? So again, feel free to pop your guesses or thoughts into the chat. So both total income and spending in the voluntary sector grew in 2018-19. However, you can see from this chart that the growth has slowed down quite a lot in recent years. And unfortunately, you can't see the number there buried underneath it. But income was up by 1% to about £56 billion, which is an increase of about £800 million on the year before. And there has been a general trend upwards in voluntary sector income. And this chart, by the way, is in real terms as well, adjusted for inflation. So you can actually see the sector has quite drastically increased its income by over £20 billion a year since the beginning of the century. We don't really know why. There are obviously a lot of things that could be driving change. So increasing donations from the public, new income streams, changes in government policy like dormant assets, or even things very directly in the control of charities like new techniques and knowledge in fundraising. And it's probably some combination of all of these things that's pushing this quite impressive growth. So back to the pop quiz. The public is and always has been the largest source of income for the voluntary sector, represents almost half or 48% of the sector's income. And this grew by almost £1 billion over the last year to 27.1 billion. And this seems to be almost entirely down to an increase in voluntary income from the public, which is one of our classifications, i.e. donations that are not linked to the provision of a service like a membership fee or something like that. So it's voluntary donations from the public has driven this growth, and it's quite a large growth. Other sources of public income, so earned income from membership fees or money from trading activities like charity shops, have remained quite stable over this time. Whereas legacies actually saw a slight decline in the year to 2018-19. And this is probably just largely to do with two particularly large donations that happened in that year. Obviously, one of the main challenges with the Almanac is that we're using this slightly outdated data. We can certainly hypothesize about where things might go from here. So one sad outcome of the last year or two is that because of COVID, we can probably expect to see an increase in legacy donations in future almanacs. We have also seen a massive over 12% increase in investment income, which is about an additional £500 million a year to the voluntary sector. We saw this was fairly evenly distributed across increases in rent income for organisations. Often organisations will let out commercial property, income from dividends and interests on deposit. So on the rent side, commercial rents we know have seen a bit of a whomping in the last year or so, so we can probably expect that to fall down again. And on the kind of dividends and interest side, over the more recent period after this point that we measure in the Almanac, this is likely to largely be foundations or trusts that have large sums of money that they don't distribute all of in each year, and they'll typically put those in investment schemes. The stock market has been fairly buoyant for a few years now, so it's no surprise we've had this increase already, and it's also continued to grow quite rapidly over the crisis as well, so we can probably expect this to continue to grow in subsequent almanacs as well. Now you may have noticed that the increases that I've mentioned, an extra 1 billion from the public and 500 million from investments, are larger than the overall increase in sector income of 800 million that I mentioned before. So you guessed it, and you can probably see from this chart as well that other sources of income have declined, most notably a fall in income from government. So in real terms, it's fallen by about 300 million after being stable for a few years. But with income from other sources growing, income from the government as a proportion of the sector's overall income has fallen almost continuously. So like the previous year, it's at its lowest ever point of 28% of overall income since the start of the series that we've been monitoring. Now, it's not a huge fall in real terms, so overall I'd say the picture of government income is relatively stable, but it does show that the government is becoming less and less important as a source of income for the sector. And other sources of income, so donations from private companies, the National Lottery, and also the voluntary sector itself, have also declined, although these are much smaller as a proportion of overall income anyway. So going on to what they spend this income on. Another pop quiz for you. So how much of the voluntary sector's income do you think is spent on directly delivering against charitable objectives? Now, I mentioned earlier that the total income is £56 billion. Now, the total spending is just underneath that at 54.2 billion, which is an increase of 2% on the year before. It's worth pointing out here that the difference between income and spending doesn't necessarily imply that there's a surplus, as some elements of income and spending are recorded in one year but used over a longer period and so on. So what does it actually spend that income on? The vast majority, £46 billion, is spent directly delivering on charitable objectives. Another 14%, or £7.7 billion, is used for generating additional funds, while the remaining 1% goes on governance. Now, that figure is roughly the same regardless of the size of the organisation in question, although smaller organisations do spend a bit less on raising funds than larger ones do. Smaller organisations also have more reported spending on governance costs, as much as 5% of their spending. But that compares to less than 1% for the super major organisations, the really, really big ones. But I think this highlights actually a challenge with the data. So we suspect that super majors are not reporting governance as a separate expense to staffing, because these organisations have in-house governance teams. Staff costs, some of which are counted towards delivering charitable activities and some counted towards generating funds, are about 43% of the sector's spending overall. And that includes your salaries, your national insurance contributions and pension costs. And this one will be worth watching in upcoming almanacs because of the increase in national insurance contributions that will be coming in next year, because this is likely to have a fairly significant impact on voluntary sector employers. It currently constitutes about 2.4% of spending overall, and the jump is fairly large. So on to the people that work in the sector. How many of them do you think there are? And again, feel free to pop these into the chat, although I'm about to give you the answer anyway, so you might not have time. Now for this data, we use the labour force survey, which means it refers to September 2020, which is after the start of the coronavirus crisis. So we are able to talk about what it says about more recent patterns in the sector. Over 950,000 people work for voluntary organisations, and they represent about 3% of the UK's total workforce. Now, this is a fairly decent increase on the last year. So as of September last year, the sector was still growing in terms of staff numbers. And since 2010, the number of people working in the voluntary sector has grown almost continuously, as you can see from this chart. Now, this is quite the opposite to the private sector, which saw a substantial contraction over the last year, almost certainly because the types of industries that had to close down during lockdowns last year. In particular, we noticed an increase in the number of older workers who were working in the voluntary sector. And this is only a hypothesis really, but it might be that because the voluntary sector is relatively more likely to offer part-time positions than other sectors, the private or public sector. So it's possible that when people in their 50s lost their private sector jobs last year, perhaps they decided to step down a few hours and maybe even work in a role they find more rewarding and step into the voluntary sector. Voluntary organisations have a higher proportion of part-time employees than other sectors. In fact, 35% of voluntary sector employees work part-time, compared to 27% in the public sector and just 24% in the private sector. And our sector also has the highest proportion of employees on temporary contracts at 8%, and that compares to public sector with 7% and the private sector with 4%. Now, the largest number of voluntary sector employees are working in the social work category, 38%. And social work is a really broad category for voluntary sector organisations. It encompasses most organisations that deliver any kind of social support or activity to people. So it's not really a great categorisation. And I'm delighted that a project that NCVO, and in particular Oliver Chan, has been involved in, has been working to develop better categorisations that fit more closely to what we think of as the types of voluntary organisations. That's with David Kane and Christopher Dam. Now, that's only just finished, so we couldn't include it in this year's almanac, but in future years we should be able to provide more meaningful breakdowns about the types of organisations. In terms of demographics, the majority of employees in our sector are women, making up to 67% of the workforce. That's quite similar to the public sector, actually, at 65%, but much higher than the private sector at 41%. The voluntary sector workforce is slightly older than other sectors and is predominantly white, with people from BAME backgrounds making up 9% of the workforce. And that's lower than the public and private sectors, which are both at 12%, and the UK's population as a whole, which is 13%. And we don't know why this is at this stage, but there is a lot of work ongoing, understanding volunteer experience, and especially the experience of diversity in voluntary organisations at NCVO and at other organisations. So, volunteering. Now, do you think volunteering increased or decreased during COVID? Now, we base our volunteering data on the Community Life Survey managed by DCMS. And we're very fortunate that the 2021 edition of this was published just in time for us to include it in this year's Almanac. So this data is very live indeed. It provides volunteering on two types: formal volunteering, which is volunteering through an organisation or club, like the kind of organisations that make up our sector, and informal volunteering, which is providing support or services to people in your community who aren't a friend or relative. Now, the type of volunteering that we at NCVO mostly look at is formal volunteering, because obviously we represent the groups or the organisations that these volunteers are volunteering for. And sadly, COVID saw a plummeting of this type of volunteering. And no doubt this is simply due to lockdowns last year and that people simply weren't able to get out. Now, the chart shows that 17% of the adult population volunteered at least once a month last year, and 22% volunteered at least once a year. And this is a fairly substantial fall, as you can see from this chart, on the year before, no doubt driven by things like the closure of National Trust buildings and other indoors activities that many people volunteer for. But there is a glimmer of hope. Because although many people couldn't volunteer formally, many instead gave their time to support their communities in informal ways. Over half of adults in the UK gave some time last year to help someone in their community, the highest it has ever been. Particularly the sudden growth in mutual aid groups, where communities banded together to offer support, such as picking up food for people who are shielding, for instance, demonstrates this entirely. And as many people have pointed out already, this suggests that there are potential new reserves of volunteers who have had their first shot helping out in the community in this last year, and who could be brought on or engaged in more formal or more regular types of volunteering in the future. So I've kind of given you the rundown of a tiny fragment of the things that you can find in the Almanac. And the important thing to highlight is that it's not a report, it is a data resource. It means that you can use it yourself to investigate various aspects of the sector, as well as looking at the summaries that we provide. So I've listed a few of the things that you can do on this slide. First and foremost, it provides lots of information about the value of the sector and its importance in society. That means you can use it for your work talking to government or local authorities about what you do, and you can make the case for the sector. You can use it to understand the potential impact of government decisions on the sector and strengthen your campaigns. You can use it to understand various sources of income in the sector and how these are changing. You can identify gaps in your income stream. You can conduct analyses of risk across these streams. You can benchmark against other organisations. Data on the funding environment, workforce or volunteers can feed into your board's decision making. You can use it to understand diversity and inclusion issues within the sector, identify potential recruitment strategies, or think about the long-term implications for the sector's workforce and volunteers. In other words, what you can do with the Almanac is really limited by your own imagination. It is absolutely huge, so please do take a look at the full data, and don't forget it's there when you are scrabbling around for information about the sector. And of course, you can always contact NCVO for more information about the Almanac, or indeed the issues that it raises. Thank you.
Brilliant, Anya. Thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. I can see we've already started to have some questions. I think my colleague Alex is going to field those. So Alex, do you want to kick off with the first question?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. So we've got a question from Tanya at 360 Giving. And Tanya asks, it looks like only the Charity Commission data rather than all sector organisations are being referred to. To what extent are the reductions in small charities because they are choosing other legal forms? So is it matched by the growth of KICs, community interest companies, and non-profit companies? Are reductions also related to the Charity Commission clearing up the register and removing more dormant organisations?
That is a good question, and I'm afraid I don't know, because we only draw from the Charity Commission register for this. Looking at other types of organisations is one of the things that we are considering for future almanacs. So I can't give you an answer now, but it's certainly something that I'm keeping an eye on. Whether it is related to the Charity Commission clearing up the register as well, that's entirely possible. So this was the 2018-19 period, and I'm not sure when they started doing so. But again, that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on, and especially in the following 2 almanacs, when we're also going to have a lot of issues related to COVID coming through as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anya. Alex, next question.
Yep. So a couple more that were messaged directly. Income from government has declined to its lowest level as a proportion of the sector's income, with some of this being a slight fall in the amount of government funding for the sector. Do we know where that reduction has come from? So, for example, is it fewer contracts going to charities?
So what we do know about it is that it is coming from a reduction in all sources of government income. So there's been a fairly small, actually, decrease in both central government income and local government income. And a pretty massive decrease in income, and I can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head, but it's pretty large, from international governments, and especially the European Union, perhaps as you would expect, given the time period that we're looking at. I don't off the top of my head know whether it's from declining contract income, but I would expect that's probably the bulk of income for local government. So I'd say it's fairly likely that it's that rather than grants. But I will have a look.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Anya. I've got a couple more. And if anyone else has any other questions, please do put them in the chat box as well. So this another question on income as well. So the sector's income has continued to grow, but you mentioned that it's slowing down. Does it look like it's going to level off kind of in future years?
That is a good question. So I suspect that one of the major, when I've been looking into this in the past, that one of the major drivers for income for the voluntary sector is broader economic growth as a whole. So you've seen this fairly large growth of sector income over the kind of 2000s, and then there was a dip during the financial crisis. And when I say actually economic growth, what I mean more specifically is income growth. So there's a fairly strong evidence that people give more generously to voluntary organisations and to charities when their income rises. So we can probably expect it more or less to follow the pattern of, and putting aside any major policy changes, and especially as income is becoming more and more dependent on public income. As we've seen, we can probably expect it to follow income growth, or at least grow as rapidly as incomes are. So they have been quite sluggish income growth in the last few years. What happens next is anyone's guess, really, because we're obviously entering quite an unusual period in terms of the broader economy. But my guess, and you can always look like an idiot if you're forecasting things, but I would expect, at least for the next 2 almanacs, which are obviously kind of following a couple of years behind, is that we'll probably see a kind of slow growth still, and then probably quite an unusual situation in 2020 specifically. I'm not sure if it will level off. It really depends on incomes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Anya. Alex just had a flurry of questions in the chat.
A flurry of questions. So actually, I'm going to pick up 2 questions around volunteering. So one was kind of, you refer to kind of a big decrease in the number of volunteers from 20 million to 16 million. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And then Kim, a question from Kim Donahue, kind of saying, do we have a sense of which volunteers have stepped back and which have stepped up for both formal and informal volunteering, for example, by age or employment?
Yes. So in terms of the decrease, so that is mainly, so that figure specifically is the formal volunteering. So these are people that are volunteering through a group, club, or organisation. So the kind of organisations that we're talking about in the Almanac. As you pointed out, there was quite a substantial drop of about 20 million to 16 million. And that I would say is almost entirely driven by this, the closure of the kind of indoors activities that a lot of people were doing. And in terms of what we know about the demographics of those people, to an extent, it's as you might expect. So the older age categories, the people most likely to volunteer in the UK is and always has been people aged 65 to 74, I think, off the top of my head. That's the age category. And that's kind of as you would expect, because these are people that are recently retired, so they have a lot more time on their hands. But they're also, you know, relatively young and in good health typically. So these people volunteer at much higher rates in general, this age category, than other age categories. What we did see over the last year is kind of, as you might expect, that more of these people were potentially shielding than other age groups. So the difference between older people and younger people did fall over the last year, although still older people do volunteer at higher rates. In terms of employment, there was quite a mixed pattern, I think, depending on whether it was informal or formal volunteering, because I can't remember it off the top of my head. However, I did do a blog post about this recently, which you should be able to find on NCVO's website, where I look at the demographics of the changes over the last year. So I'd refer you to dig that out, and I will post it in the chat after I've finished presenting.
Thanks, Anya. A couple more questions on volunteering. And so these are quite specific. So we might not have the data, but I'll leave you to know. So you mentioned statistics relating to volunteering. Are there any statistics around a growth or fall in the number of people volunteering as trustees specifically?
Not in the Almanac. However, for anyone who's got the time and the data analysis abilities, that probably is something that you can do fairly easily with the Charity Commission register, because it does include a list of trustees. So we didn't look at it specifically for this, but I do invite anyone who's interested in that to dig it out. It's probably quite simple to do.
Thanks, Anya. So a more general question. So what this Almanac refers to data financial year 18-19. What does this tell us about the state of the sector going into the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that is that is kind of what I would say about what it does. Is it kind of gives us a baseline from which we could understand the what happened directly before the pandemic, which I think was actually really useful for NCVO, for instance, when we were going to government with our various asks after lockdown last year. We were able to say, well, we know roughly the sector is this size just before the pandemic happened, and then we were able to combine it with other sources of data. So we were also doing kind of more rapid response forms of research, like, for instance, a survey that we've been doing with Nottingham Trent University, the COVID impact barometer, which many people attending today might be even participating in. So we kind of we're able to take the Almanac data as a baseline, and then also look at a kind of survey data and things like that, and say, well, you know, we know that it's roughly this big, and therefore we know, and then we know that organisations are saying they're going to lose X% of their income. So then we're able to provide rough estimates of how big the drop is. So although it's, you know, it's a real challenge with the Almanac that it's slightly out of date, it was actually extremely useful even in this kind of urgent situation where we needed much more live forms of data. I mean, it was kind of the best resource that we had as a basis for those asks.
Thanks, Anya. Are there more questions, Alex?
Yep, there's a few more. So the next question is, do we have data on the number of charities who have no paid staff?
Yes, I think we do. You know, I'm not entirely sure if I have it. I don't have it to hand. However, I'm pretty sure it is in the data tables. So if you go onto the Almanac website, you can follow through any of the pages. It will give you the option to download more data. And in those data tables, you should be able to find a list of organisations by employee size. I will double check it's in there, and if it's not, I'll add it because that data is available from the labour force survey, I think.
Great, thanks, Anya. So that is all of the questions we have so far. So a final ask, if people have any questions now. In which case, Sarah, back to you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for all of the comments in the chat, everybody. It's great to get all of the feedback. Thank you, Anya, for answering all these questions so brilliantly. So we're really excited to have been able to share this report with the sector this afternoon. Some absolutely fascinating findings around public sector funding, around how income growth is linked to broader economic growth, around volunteering, and as Anya just said, a really good baseline of where the sector was coming into the pandemic. So just to say that with our headline sponsors, Saracen and Partners, we will be hosting a webinar focusing on financial data and insight early in 2022. So do join us for that. I think, you know, the Almanac is such an essential piece of research for all of us to understand the work of the sector. And over the next year, we are going to be thinking about how we evolve it, particularly to give us that more real-time understanding in terms of the shape and size and finances of charities and volunteering. And we look forward to talking to members about that. So once again, thank you so much to everyone who's been involved in putting together this year's Almanac. And thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah, Alex, and team. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Well done.
Thanks, everyone. I will close the call now. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Well done, Anya.
Yeah, great session. Many thanks.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
Bye.
See you soon.
Well done,
Bye,
Sarah,
Rachel.
Anya. Thank you. And all, Alex.
Brilliant. Thanks. I think it's mostly us now, actually. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. A great session, I thought, and see you all soon. I'll follow up on email with everyone as well.
Okay, many thanks, Alex.
Brilliant.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good afternoon. Bye.